I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
So let's take a trip over to Michigan quickly. I think the historic bankruptcy filing by the city of Detroit has exposed the issues that were just discussed in plain sight for the nation and for the world to see, as has become evident, especially to the men and women who are living in Detroit today. There are severe and lasting consequences to this issue of crowd out and America's broken public pension system. As a frequent traveler to Detroit myself, I've witnessed firsthand how residents in some of the strongest neighborhoods in Detroit are forced to pay out of their own pockets, beyond their taxes, for the things that we take for granted: basic services, private security, private sanitation, private snow removal, all being done with fewer streetlights and deteriorating roads. Now, there is perhaps no single person in this country who is better equipped to speak about this sort of budget squeeze than our next speaker. John Engler served as the 46th governor of the great state of Michigan from 1991 to 2003. The list of his accomplishments in Michigan and elsewhere could consume a conference in and of themselves. But most notable for today's gathering was his leadership in making Michigan the first state to implement comprehensive reform of a statewide pension system. He did it by moving state workers from defined benefit plans, which you heard about just now, to defined contribution plans. And really, most notably and inspiring for me, Governor, you did it in a place that was long considered a fortress for organized labor. As he'll explain, this historic reform allowed workers to receive more compensation up front, and it allowed their employer, the government, to reward them while on the job. Meanwhile, in Detroit, where city workers were unaffected by this historic shift in 1997, things continued as they had always been. And today, the consequences of doing nothing in Motown are painfully clear. Perhaps with the city now in bankruptcy proceedings, some of the successes born in Lansing nearly 20 years ago will start to influence Detroit. With that, it's my great pleasure to welcome the former president and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers, the former governor of the state of Michigan, and the president of the Business Roundtable, the Honorable John Engler.
Well, I'll put that over there so I don't knock it over in the middle of the remarks. Thank you very much. What a delight to be here at the Manhattan Institute. But as you just heard in the introduction, this is a long time ago that I was governor and we were doing these things, so I'm a little bit of the history, but boy, things have moved since that time, and I'm just delighted that I could be with the Manhattan Institute and this very distinguished group of speakers today. I thought the previous panel was terrific, and they added much more perhaps than I can. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, although I do want to recognize the role at the Manhattan Institute. The scholars here have they've paid attention to this pension issue for a long time, and it's an issue that you've actually done important work on, and you've been raising the red flag, or flags, I guess, multiple flags over multiple years, and it's nice to see that some of that work is being now recognized by public officials and political leaders in the country. Of course, it's been sort of accelerated by a few bankruptcies in places like Stockton and Jefferson County and Alabama, Jefferson County, Alabama, and Detroit. The Detroit bankruptcy court's probably going to be making a lot of important new law, I think, because we have a collision there that's very much at issue. The constitutional protection in the Michigan Constitution of pension benefits versus the federal bankruptcy law, and so that's all on the table. What I was asked to talk about today, the title sort of assigned was that lessons learned from Great Lakes, how Michigan saved public services. You've just heard in Detroit, not so much. There's a big challenge there. But at the state level, if we look at sort of what's been going on, and frankly, if you look at the fiscal situation in Washington, but more importantly, I think Illinois, California, Chicago, it's pretty safe to say that sustaining high-quality public services is an ongoing challenge for anyone in public service today. Rahm Emanuel was mentioned, that I actually, one of my folks had sent along the article that just had appeared in the Chicago papers, where he was quoted as saying, you know, that we will not preside over a city in which garbage isn't picked up, graffiti isn't removed, and libraries and other vital public services aren't provided to citizens who depend on them. And that was how he was talking about some of the challenges that they were facing, that they didn't get the pension reforms approved in Springfield. And our experience in Michigan, I think, is useful in that I think there's a demonstration there that even when, you know, just because things are broken doesn't mean you can't fix them. And in the case of the public pensions, I think that, you know, we have a duty, those of us who are in charge, or in my case, you know, was in a role where I could make a difference as a governor, there's a duty. And that duty runs to the retirees, certainly those who are already retired and those who hope to someday retire, and to the taxpayers who are picking up the tab, and not only today's taxpayers, but those in the future. In '91, when I took office, the state of Michigan faced some pretty significant challenges, and some of those needed pretty immediate attention. We had a budget deficit at that time of about $1.8 billion. We had very significant economic challenges, and we had to deal with that. We had an unemployment trust fund deficit with probably more than $2 billion, and then the pension liabilities, of course, they were the far and away the greatest. They weren't in our, you know, sort of operating budget, but they were there on the balance sheet, and they're sort of like a large iceberg, I guess, in a fiscal ocean. You know, you can see a little bit of it. You had to make the annual contribution, but the real liabilities were largely hidden, and like an iceberg, they're pretty darn dangerous, we felt. Now, we had set out a goal, the administrative team that we'd assembled, to not only get the state's fiscal balance sheet straightened out, but also to see if we couldn't get back to a AAA rating. Michigan at one time had been AAA rated, but been a very, very long time. That actually proved to take nearly all 3 terms that I served as governor. It wasn't exactly easy to get there. But one of the things that we had concluded early on is that we needed to talk about the state's unfunded liabilities, and the pension liabilities we did report. We actually never had any requirement to report unfunded health liabilities. That wasn't something you put in a financial report. We disclosed a number and put it in just because we thought we need to start bringing that forward. And part of the philosophy I've always had is if you're trying to solve a problem, you got to get the facts out, and transparency becomes awfully important. And that's true whether you're trying to fix federal entitlements or you're at the state level trying to deal with your unfunded liabilities, or in some cases, not a pension issue, but some of the bonded indebtedness that states and local governments have stacked up. I mean, those do have to be paid back, and we really believe that transparency is important, and it's one of the reasons I strongly support and think that there's room for considerable improvement around the country in terms of requiring full transparency of all of these public pension funds. Sometimes it's actually easier at the state level, where you've got a legislative body, you've got a governor, and you've got some pretty, I think in virtually every state, probably some pretty smart people that are in those state capitals or in those state administrations who can do this stuff. One of the areas where it is very problematic is in the proliferation of pension funds that exist at the state and local level. And in a lot of states, they're a little more complex. They've got all kinds of authorities, and you'd be surprised the different entities that actually have a pension fund out there. And I think sometimes it's not even recognized how many of them are there. And it might have looked good once upon a time, but maybe the purpose for which the authority was set up is, has changed, and some of these are just sort of looming there, and they're around. Michigan has a strong local control tradition, and I think most states have a fair amount of that, and you have more local control if they've got the debt out there. You're in charge. It wasn't ours, but at the same time, as we've seen, when a large municipality like Detroit, say in Michigan, that had an impact on bond sales for other municipalities within the state. There were a couple that simply couldn't go to market at the time they wanted to go because of those problems. I don't think it's an area where national legislation necessarily is needed, but I think state legislators ought to be trying to figure out how you can build upon. And we heard, I think, Joshua's point on GASB, and we had the one question that came in from the audience. I do think that there's ways to improve the reporting and let people have a true picture, because there are folks who depend or who are believing they've got future economic security based on some pension, which is built on something that's pretty tenuous. And so I think some kind of transparency legislation state by state, and maybe the Manhattan Institute could help get that all drafted and get some of these state lawmakers working on it. But it's been interesting when you see a state treasurer in Rhode Island step up the way she did, or you see Mayor Reed, who's going to come up here in a little bit, what he's done, and the article on his work, mentioned several other mayors that were coming together, and now how they're trying to join together to do something on the statewide ballot in California. There's just so much that needs to be known and understood. The real rate of return on some of these pension funds, and we've had this almost zero interest rate environment for a long time. That's had a big impact. You've got to know what the liabilities are. Are the liabilities going up? Are they going down? So this QE3 world that we're living in, it probably doesn't last forever. I keep pushing the date out, but that's going to have an impact. And I think if pension funds aren't properly funded, there's probably also, I think, an argument to be made that local governments should be prohibited from raising benefits or expanding eligibility or doing any number of things that sometimes get done at the bargaining table. That used to be one of the biggest challenges that we faced in Michigan. And I'm not going to talk about school pension funds. They're a separate system in Michigan. And to the governor's credit today, Governor Snyder, and his work with the legislature has been able to dramatically change some of the projections on unfunded liabilities in the Michigan public school employees system. But in the old days, back before the mid-90s, what would happen in Michigan is actually the state was paying the benefits costs, but the local school districts were doing the negotiation. So you can imagine what happened if you're trying to do a contract and you're trying to argue about wages and you're trying to hold the line on wages. Well, where was the wiggle room? Well, it's over on the benefits side. They kept adding to the benefits because, after all, the state paid that. And not part of pension reform, but part of what I call government reform is when we restructured property taxes in Michigan, we actually sort of rebased all the schools and gave them the money. We adjusted the school budgets and allocated to them the payments that the state had been making on their behalf, and said, okay, henceforth, now when you negotiate, you'll just remit to the state the cost of those benefits. And the schools weren't very happy about that, and they understood what had been handed to them was a fairly rapidly escalating cost, and that's one of the things that finally, 20 years later, in this last legislative session, they've been able to adjust in Michigan, and it's had a dramatic effect. But back to the Michigan pension story, because it is kind of an interesting one. How did this get done in 1996, become effective in early 97? We looked at, I said that we were driven by this idea to have a AAA rating. We also want a strong business climate, and we felt that one of the things that got looked at by companies looking at states who were competing as a business location is what's your balance sheet look like, and unfunded liabilities did have an impact. And we felt compelled to look at the state's pension plans. We also were taking a look down the road. We were understanding that the private sector had been moving rather rapidly away from the old defined benefit programs toward DC programs, and that was more than a trend. That wasn't something that, in our judgment, was going to end anytime soon. And of course, they had the benefit of them being funded from day one. The state treasurer in Michigan at the time, a man named Doug Roberts, very, very able individual, was tasked with leading the study and doing a lot of the preparation. One of the things that came out as we looked at pensions and some of our options was kind of an interesting statistic. And again, it was a point that was made here on the previous panel. Almost half the people that came to work for state government under the old system walked away with nothing. They got their money back, but you had to be in those days in 10 years in state service before you qualified or vested in the system. Well, half the people didn't stay that long because we were already seeing much more mobility. And so it worked well for somebody that stayed 30 years, but not so good if you stayed 9 years. You got some money back and sent on your way. So we thought there was an opportunity to have an approach that would result in us having a system that was actually more attractive in terms of persuading people maybe to come to work for state government. In those days, the economy was a little bit better. In the 90s, we actually had to compete a little harder for people to talk them into coming to work for state government. But we thought if we could get people who were confident in their abilities, but we could also tell them from day one, you can start setting something aside for your future, and if you want to go on to do something else, that money will go with you. You've got an account. And so we thought that was going to work well. We also thought for some of our existing workers that they might like to have a little bit more control, and they wouldn't feel sort of trapped, because that was the other thing that a lot of the teacher pension systems and the old state system, once you're in them, you feel like you can never leave them, because they've sort of got, I mean, it's golden handcuffs at a very different kind of level, but nonetheless, you just felt, boy, I don't want to go and leave this on the table. So what we tried to do was think about how to put a program together and what it might look like. The other factor that was in there, I think, to explain the politics of this a little bit, is that we had for, now we're 6 years in, I'd been reelected in '94, so we've been 6 years in office. We had never allowed an early out program. There were always senior officials who, I mean, a lot of people familiar with public pensions know that every so often it seems like an early out gets done, early retirement, little boost in that final retirement if I retire early. And there was a lot of push for that, and we had steadfastly resisted that, saying, look, we need you to stay in government, we need your services, we need your experience. So we actually tied up the concept of an early out also with the pension reform to build a little extra support. But when we got all done, we thought this is something that, boy, 30 years from now, somebody's going to look back on this and say, boy, this made a big difference on the balance sheet. We did not realize it would come this quickly, that it would already be of significance. And the other thing that we also did is we didn't target this just at state employees. As I said, we tried to include the public school employees, and those are two different systems in Michigan. But there also were separate systems for state legislators and judges, and we put all of those programs in the same system. So we actually had a defined contribution for everybody who was a public employee at the state level in Michigan, and for the school teachers. The only people we couldn't reach is a small group of state police troopers and sergeants, and in Michigan a few years back, they were successful in adding a constitutional amendment concerning collective bargaining to the Constitution, and so you couldn't get at their benefits because that ended up, there was a carve-out on bargain. They have a right to bargain their benefits under the constitutional provision, which they wrote for themselves and then got it passed. But so we got everybody, all state employees by March 31 of '97, Anybody newly hired to the state would become a member of a defined contribution plan. We made it with no votes to spare in the House and 1 vote to spare in the Senate. But the public school employee bill failed by 2 votes, and so that's why that didn't get done. Today, about over 2/3, almost 70% of all Michigan workers at the state government are in the defined contribution plan. All judges, all legislators are all in defined contribution plans, and the public school employees actually now have moved somewhat in that direction. There have been changes under both Governor Granholm and continuing under Governor Snyder. Governor Snyder dramatically changing it in this past legislative session. We've got a situation where there's about 55,000 of those employees in total, so as I said, nearly 70% in D.C. They're today supporting about 60,000 who are retired and several thousands more who probably are entitled to benefits but not yet drawing them. But the old DB plan was completely frozen. We did not take the step of making it a hard freeze and saying, okay, your benefits are terminated and going forward, everything that you accrue will be in the new system. There's a bit of a nod to political reality. What could we pass? We also did give back then because we were in a strong financial position, and this is not the case for governmental units today, but we did give the employees an opportunity to actually transition. If they've been working for the state for 30 years and they wanted to move over from a DB plan to a DC plan, we allowed that to take place. They could cash out, in effect. Under the defined contribution plan, the state contributes 4% of salary and then matches an additional 3% above that for a maximum of 7% employer contribution. That's not overly generous, but we do allow additional employee contributions as well. But it is sort of an approach that when we got this done, we had a couple of things, and I guess one thing I would say that is really important from a crafting of any solution like this. We probably spent a year getting ready. I mentioned the state treasurer's doing a lot of studies as to what we had to do, but we also engaged in some very serious work with law firms and actuaries and that to make sure we had the drafting perfect. You only get one chance at doing these. These are, you don't want, it's not like writing, well, I guess I could point to Washington. There's a couple of big bills down there. They're having a little trouble implementing, because the complexity is such. Well, this is pretty complex too, and really technical. And I'm proud to say that the team got it absolutely right. I mean, we didn't find afterwards, oh no, you made a mistake and you screwed it up, or you made it vulnerable to a legal challenge. None of that happened. So the program's been a major success. The actuary, the Mackinac Policy Center, which is a state-level think tank that I'm very proud of in Michigan, they wrote a policy brief in June of 2011, and the actuary who was the author of that report was saying that there was nearly $200 million in direct savings between 97 and 2010, but more importantly, the long-term liabilities were down to about $4.1 billion as unfunded liability under the old DB plan. And if we'd have continued to have that plan just running forward, that could have been easily double that number. So it had a pretty profound impact there. And obviously for anybody that's in the DC program, no underfunding there because that's fully funded from the beginning. It also takes away all of the incentives to play the games, because I remember my early years in the legislature, and I spent a lot of years as a legislator before becoming governor. Inevitably, every year, somebody had a bill to increase pension benefits for state employees, especially if you happen to be in the district, say, surrounding the state capitol or in areas where there were large concentrations, and you were always out there being the champion. And those were always difficult for lawmakers to kind of fend off, and they didn't always fend them off. And so legislative bodies can behave like a city council or a board of supervisors at times. You can take the easy way out and, well, yeah, we'll give it's a good year, let's add a little bit. The other temptation was if, we had those very high interest rate years, so you had some big earning years. So, hey, let's not make any contributions this year. We can, we've earned enough, so we don't need to put more in. Very open to kind of games being played under the old system, and with the defined contribution program, none of this at all, really. So the opportunities to play games, I think, have largely gone away. The Mackinac Center in that same report said it's difficult to quantify the savings from improved political incentives, but they conclude this category may be the single largest area of savings over time, a bit almost of an understatement, but it does, I think, highlight the vulnerability of maintaining the old DB systems. Now, it doesn't work so well when budgets are tight and interest rates are at zero and you're in crisis. It gets hard, but unfortunately, it's just as hard to sort of rein things in as it is easy to hand it out when times are good. So, bottom line, it doesn't work very well politically in good times or in bad would be my conclusion. And you can see the ultimate of this in Detroit, where the recent sentencing of the mayor and some of his people in his administration, including some that had responsibilities on pension boards, what happens, because if that's the other side of this too, is that there's an investment feature. The way this works, if you're in a DB plan, that may or may not be in the interests of those employees that are depending on that. With the DC plan, normally what you're doing is then choosing among options that are out there in the public and regulated by independent regulators, so the games don't get played there. I will say that Detroit has something like $18 billion in estimated long-term liabilities. Much of that is pension. We're going to see how this works, but an example of how it worked poorly was before bankruptcy loomed in Detroit. You had the city council authorizing payments to employees that actually included a bonus, what they called a 13th month of benefits, and those went out really just by action of the city council because they had the money and it'd be nice to do that for the employees. Well, those are the kind of things that should never be allowed when there's unfunded liabilities. Let me maybe just stop here. I want to take some questions and maybe talk a little bit more about what got done. I think that this is a topic that is important to be discussing. I noted also from Illinois, we'll pick on them a little bit today, because while Rahm Emanuel's talking about what he doesn't want to happen in the future, one of his, I think it's his senator, because I think he's a senator, I think from Chicago, but he's Senate President, Senator Cullerton. He said this in a radio interview just recently. He said that even though they've got a $100 billion unfunded pension liability, which is probably on a per capita basis about the worst of any state, he said people really misunderstand the nature of this whole problem. Quite frankly, I don't think you can use the word crisis to describe it at the state level. Well, he couldn't be here today to talk about this, but I think we are pretty much aware that if there's $100 billion unfunded, if it's not a crisis, I'm not sure what it is, but it's pretty darn serious. And I don't think there are ways forward, but stalling and putting off decisions are not the way to go forward. And I'm pleased that back in the '96 we were able to get this done, and it does represent today an option that people can look at and say, here's something that has been tested. And we did get this done way back before Michigan became a right-to-work state, so it was a long time ago. Thank you very much. So we can open it up.
It's not a fantasy. You did it. You did it a long time ago. So it'd be worth keeping that in mind when we get to our second panel. Just real quickly, I want to get to the audience. We don't have much time, but what do you see, as somebody who's been in politics, as the prospects for a political coalition for reform? What might its elements be, and how realistic is it to see such a coalition formed, do you think, today?
Well, I think that, there are Democrats and Republicans that are leading on this. I think that I noted it was interesting to see the treasurer in Rhode Island, how she stepped forward there. And really an entirely Democrat, well, I guess independent governor, but a Democrat legislature, really framed the issues in such a way that action became unavoidable. They had to act. And I think the key thing is leadership. It can come from the right or the left or the center. I mean, so, and the leadership has to be, as she did, and I think as we tried to do, put it in terms of what the economic facts are. This is going to be a burden on a state. I was with a group yesterday in Washington, and 2 or 3 in the room were from Illinois, and I said, I don't know what you're thinking about the future, but it seems to me that expanding in Illinois today or relocating to Illinois is to buy into being part of the solution in the future, and that means you're going to pay for it. And I think that's going to work against those jurisdictions, and I think that's going to hurt them in the competition for jobs. So I think there's that part of it. I think the other is just a fairness question. I mean, we're misleading people about what's going to be there for them. I feel very bad about what's going on in Detroit because this has been a very slowly unfolding and predictable crisis that's now sort of arrived. They just didn't, I think Joshua said it, I mean, they're just sort of at the, they're at the front end of the, but that doesn't mean the epidemic stops there. They may be, nearly patient zero here, but it's going to continue on. But for the people who are there in Detroit, there's some very hard choices. I mean, the health benefits are all going to be now, I think, under the Affordable Care Act, not under any other, Detroit-funded program, and the things, some of the, and the UAW found this out in the auto industry. I mean, so there's actually in Michigan, unfortunately, there's some, and executives at General Motors found this out too. There's still litigation, I think, from General Motors and Delphi executives about some of the benefits they lost that they thought they were going to get before bankruptcy. I think we have an obligation to be straight with people about what's awaiting them. And so I think there are coalitions that can get built. I also think that we made a lot out of the fact, and nobody had an effective rebuttal for the idea, wait a minute, is it really fair that 50% of the people that work for the state of Michigan, for whatever period of time, short of 10 years, walked away with nothing? Is that what we want? Is that attractive to get somebody to come? And nobody could really rebut that or say, well, oh no, that's okay. Because the point was made of the previous panel. Really, what was happening is senior people were depending on those contributions. It's sort of like what goes on in immigration today. I mean, we got people who are illegally paying into the Social Security system to help support the system, but they don't gain benefit out of it.
Right. So I just point out that the governor's referring to the Rhode Island example. The state treasurer is Gina Raimondo, who the Manhattan Institute honored as our Urban Innovator of the Year last year. She's currently running for governor, and I think trying to frame up the issues in some of the ways that the governor suggested. We have time for one question, if we have a question, for Governor Engler. If not, please join me in thanking Governor John Engler.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.